The dish was called caldo verde, Portuguese kale soup. My grandmother's recipe, the one she'd brought from the Azores to New Bedford, Massachusetts, in 1961, packed not in a suitcase but in her memory, alongside the names of the saints and the sound of the Atlantic hitting the volcanic cliffs of São Miguel at dawn. It was peasant food. My mother-in-law was right about that. It was the food of fishermen's wives and factory workers, of women who had to feed 8 children on a longshoreman's wages, who learned to make a pot of potatoes and kale and linguica sausage taste like love because love was the only ingredient they could afford in abundance. My mother-in-law, Judith Crane Whitfield, pushed the bowl away from her like it contained something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "We don't eat poor people food in this house," she said. And her husband, Richard, sitting at the head of their 12-seat dining table in their colonial revival home in Wellesley, Massachusetts, a house with 6 bedrooms and a 3-car garage and a sub-zero refrigerator that held more imported cheese than a French market, laughed. Not a cruel laugh. A comfortable one. The laugh of a man who agreed with his wife so reflexively that cruelty and habit had become indistinguishable. My husband, Declan, set down his fork. "Mom, that's..."
"What?"
"Honest? Declan, I spent 2 days preparing this meal. The turkey is brined in champagne. The stuffing has truffle butter. The cranberry sauce has Grand Marnier. And your wife brings..." She gestured at my pot of soup like she was identifying evidence at trial.
"Kale."
"In broth. With sausage from a Portuguese deli. It's linguica, Judith. It's not Thanksgiving. It's what you serve at a soup kitchen." She picked up her champagne flute, Waterford Crystal, because Judith Crane Whitfield did not drink from vessels that hadn't been manufactured in Ireland, and smiled at me. That smile. The one I'd been receiving for 11 years. The one that said, "I tolerate you, dear, but we both know you don't belong here. Thank you for bringing it, Marigold." It was thoughtful. "Marigold. My name." She said it the way you'd say a word in a language you found vaguely amusing. Like the name itself was evidence of my unsuitability, too floral, too ethnic, too much color for a family that preferred beige. I said nothing. I sat at that 12-seat table with its champagne-brine turkey and its truffle butter and its Waterford Crystal, and I said nothing. Because my phone was going to ring in approximately 14 minutes, and when it did, the champagne flute in Judith Crane Whitfield's hand was going to become the least important piece of crystal in the room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the food first. Because in this story, the food is everything. I am the great-granddaughter of Azorean fishermen. My family came to New Bedford on the same boats that had been running between the Azores and Massachusetts since the whaling era. Portuguese immigrants who settled in the south end of the city, near the docks, in triple-decker houses with tiny backyards where they grew kale and tomatoes and kept chickens until the city codes said they couldn't. My grandmother, Avu Celeste, was the center of that world. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall and had hands that could get a cod in 30 seconds and make a roux in 60, and she ran her kitchen on Acushnet Avenue like a general runs a field operation, with precision, authority, and absolutely no tolerance for waste. Nothing was thrown away in Avu Celeste's kitchen. Fish bones became stock. Stale bread became a corda. The green tops of beets became refogato. Every scrap had purpose. Every ingredient had dignity. She taught me to cook the way her mother had taught her. Not from recipes, but from rhythm. The sound of onions hitting hot olive oil. The exact shade of golden brown that means garlic is ready. The way dough feels under your palms when it's been kneaded enough, alive, almost, warm and elastic and breathing. She'd stand behind me at the counter, her chin barely reaching my shoulder by the time I was 12, and guide my hands through the movements she'd been making since she was a child in São Miguel. "Food is memory, Marigold," she'd say. "You don't just feed the stomach. You feed the person. You remind them of who they are, where they came from, who loved them first." I believed her. I believe her still. Everything I've ever cooked, from a pot of caldo verde to a $340 tasting menu, begins with that sentence. You remind them of who they are. I was supposed to go to college. My parents. My father drove a bread truck for Sid Wainer and Son. My mother was a teaching assistant at Roosevelt Middle School, Had saved enough for UMass Dartmouth. I got in. I even went for 1 semester, studying business because my father thought a business degree was universal. But I was 17 and already knew that the only business I wanted to build was one that smelled like Avu Celeste's kitchen. So I did something that my family supported, but the Crane Whitfields would later cite as evidence of my fundamental unseriousness. I dropped out and enrolled in the culinary program at Johnson and Wales University in Providence. Not the 4-year bachelor's. The associates. 2 years of foundations, knife skills, stocks and sauces, baking, butchery, nutrition science, restaurant management. I graduated in 2006, 20 years old, $34,000 in debt, with a set of Westhoff knives and a certainty that I was going to spend the rest of my life cooking food that reminded people of who they were. The Crane Whitfields would later describe this as trade school. Judith once told a friend, within my hearing, that Marigold had a little certificate from a cooking school in Rhode Island. She did not mention that Johnson and Wales is one of the most respected culinary institutions in the country. She did not mention it because she did not know it, and she did not know it because she had never asked. Asking would require curiosity, and curiosity would require the acknowledgement that my world contained things worth knowing about. After Johnson and Wales, I spent 6 years in the trenches. That's the only word for the early years of a professional kitchen, trenches. I worked the line at Bonder in Cambridge, a farm-to-table restaurant where Chef Jason Bond was doing things with local ingredients that made me rethink everything I knew about New England cuisine. I staged at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Lisbon for 3 months, Bel Canto, under Chef José Áviles, where I learned that Portuguese food wasn't peasant food. It was one of the great undiscovered cuisines of Europe, as complex and layered as French or Japanese, built on centuries of global exploration and ingredient exchange. I came back to Massachusetts with a fire in me that I couldn't explain and that nobody in my immediate circle understood, except Avu Celeste, who was 87 by then and whose hands had slowed but whose palate was still the sharpest I'd ever known. I'd bring her dishes I was developing, deconstructed calderata, a modern take on bacalhau au bras, caldo verde reimagined with smoked duck and black truffle, and she'd taste them with her eyes closed and say either sim or neo. That was her entire critical vocabulary. Yes or no. The food either remembered where it came from or it didn't. I met Declan Whitfield in 2011 at a food and wine event in Boston's Seaport District. He was there representing his family's investment firm, Crane Whitfield Capital, a mid-sized private equity shop that managed about $400 million in assets, mostly old New England money that wanted steady returns and quarterly reports printed on heavy paper. Declan was the youngest of 3 sons, and unlike his brothers Graham, who ran the fund, and Sterling, who practiced corporate law at Ropes and Gray, Declan had the misfortune of being kind. Not ambitious kind. Not strategically kind. Just kind. The kind of man who asked the catering staff if they'd had a chance to eat, who remembered your name after meeting you once, who fell in love with a Portuguese cook from New Bedford because she handed him a spoonful of saffron-braised octopus and he said, with complete sincerity, "This tastes like something important." We married in 2013. Small ceremony at the Whaling Museum in New Bedford, which Judith did not attend because she had a conflict that turned out to be a garden party she could have skipped. Declan's father came. He shook my father's hand and made conversation about the bread industry for 11 minutes, which was, by Crane Whitfield standards, an act of extraordinary generosity. And then began the holidays. 11 Thanksgivings. I need you to understand what 11 years of the Wellesley dining table felt like. It wasn't dramatic. That's what people don't understand about this kind of cruelty. It's not a single act. It's atmospheric. It's the air pressure in the room slowly dropping until you can't breathe but can't point to the reason why. Year 1, I brought Portuguese sweetbread, massa cevada, for dessert. Judith served it as an option, alongside her own pumpkin cheesecake. Nobody touched the bread. I found it in the trash the next morning, still wrapped in the cloth I'd carried it in. Year 3, I made bacalhau salt cod, the national dish of Portugal, prepared the way Avu Celeste taught me, with hand-shredded cod and Yukon Gold potatoes and olive oil from a producer in Trás-os-Montes. Judith's friend Beverly said it smelled strong. Judith moved it to the kitchen counter. Let's keep the stronger dishes away from the table, dear. Some people have sensitive palates. Year 5, Declan asked his mother to let me prepare one dish for the main table. Judith agreed. I made arroz de pato, duck rice, one of Portugal's great dishes, a casserole of rice baked with roasted duck and churrasco and olives. Graham's wife, Thea, took one look and said, "Is that rice? For Thanksgiving?" She said rice the way Judith said marigold, like it was inherently out of place. Year 7, I stopped bringing traditional dishes and made a roasted root vegetable gratin that was as New England as it gets. Judith tasted it and said, "Oh, this is nice. See, marigold? You can cook normal food when you try." Normal food. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. Year 9, Avu Celeste died. She was 93. She died in her sleep in the house on Acushnet Avenue with the smell of caldo verde still in the walls and the sound of Portuguese radio drifting up from the kitchen where she'd cooked for 70 years. I missed Thanksgiving that year. I was in New Bedford, cleaning out her kitchen, wrapping her cast-iron pans in newspaper, finding her handwritten recipe cards in a tin box above the stove, each one a love letter in her cramped, immigrant handwriting, measurements in pinches and handfuls, ingredients listed in Portuguese because some words don't translate. Judith sent a card. "Sorry for your loss. See you at Christmas." That was the year the grief turned into something else. Something with heat and direction and a very specific plan. In 2019, I opened a restaurant. Not in Boston, where the Crane Whitfields would have noticed. Not in New York, where the food media would have made it impossible to stay anonymous. I opened it in Portland, Maine, 60 miles from the Wellesley dining table but a world away in every sense that mattered. The restaurant was called Avu. Avu, the Portuguese word for grandmother. I'd agonized over the name for months. Declan suggested Celeste, which was beautiful but too personal. I wasn't ready to put my grandmother's name on something that might fail. My business partner, a restaurant industry veteran named Augusto, whom I'd met during my stage in Lisbon and who'd moved to the States specifically to help me build this, suggested Mare. Tide. Poetic, but it didn't say what I needed it to say. In the end, the name chose itself. Because every dish I made, every recipe I developed, every decision I made about flavors and textures and the specific temperature at which olive oil becomes something more than oil, all of it began with the same word. Avu. Grandmother. The woman who started everything. It was a 32-seat restaurant in a converted fishing warehouse on Custom House Wharf, with reclaimed wood tables that Declan and I had sanded ourselves over 3 weekends, an open kitchen because I wanted guests to see the cooking the way I'd seen Avu Celeste cook. No walls, no pretense, just hands and fire and ingredients transforming, and windows that looked out onto Casco Bay, where the lobster boats came and went with the same rhythm as the fishing boats in the Azores that my grandmother had watched as a child. The menu was Portuguese. Not Portuguese-inspired. Not New England meets the Azores. Portuguese. Caldo verde made with the darkest lacinado kale and smoked linguica from a producer in Fall River who'd been making it the same way since 1953. Bacalhau prepared 7 ways, one for each day of the week. Arroz de marisco, seafood rice, made with Maine lobster and littleneck clams and Mozambican piri-piri, a nod to Portugal's centuries of culinary exchange with Africa and Asia. Pastéis de nata for dessert, custard tarts with shattering puff pastry, the recipe adapted from the monks of Bulem, served with espresso that I roasted myself in a small drum roaster I kept in the back. Every dish was built on Avu Celeste's foundation. Every dish began with her sentence. You remind them of who they are. The first year was brutal. Portland had a crowded restaurant scene, and nobody was asking for Portuguese food. I worked 18-hour days. I burned through my savings. I nearly closed in March of 2020 when the pandemic shut down indoor dining, and I had to pivot to takeout and meal kits that I packed myself in the empty dining room while crying into a pot of caldo verde. But the food was good. The food was true. And eventually the people who know how to listen, the food writers and the critics and the chefs who eat at each other's restaurants on their nights off, started paying attention. The Portland Press Herald gave us 4 stars. Then Maine Magazine did a feature. Then the Boston Globe's food critic, who'd driven up from Massachusetts for dinner, wrote a review that included the sentence, "Avu is not just the best Portuguese restaurant in New England. It is one of the best restaurants in America, period." I didn't send that review to Judith. I taped it to the wall of my kitchen, next to Avu Celeste's recipe card for caldo verde, and I went back to work. By 2022, Avu had been recognized by the James Beard Foundation, semi-finalist for Best Chef, Northeast. By 2023, we'd been named one of Bon Appetit's best new restaurants in America. We were technically 4 years old, but the magazine operated on its own timeline. We'd been featured in the New York Times, Eater, Food and Wine, and a documentary about immigrant food traditions that aired on PBS. And then the Michelin Guide came to Maine. Michelin had expanded its coverage beyond New York, Chicago, and California in recent years, adding cities and regions that had previously been off the radar. When they announced they'd be reviewing restaurants in Maine for the first time, the Portland food world went into a quiet frenzy. Every chef in the city knew what a Michelin star could mean. Not just prestige, but survival. The difference between a restaurant that struggles and one that has a 6-month waiting list. I tried not to think about it. I failed. Every service, I'd scan the dining room and wonder, is that person an inspector? The Michelin system is famously anonymous. They don't announce themselves. They don't take notes at the table. They eat, they pay, they leave. You never know until the stars are announced. My sous chef, Bento, a young Portuguese-American kid from Fall River who'd trained at the Culinary Institute of America and came to Avu because he wanted to cook the food his Avu made, asked me once how I'd feel if we got a star. "I'd feel like my grandmother's food was being seen," I said. "Not my food. Hers." "Chef, with respect, it's your food. You took her recipes and turned them into something that..." "Bento, the foundation is hers. I'm just building on it. If anyone deserves a star, it's the woman who figured out how to make a pot of kale and potatoes taste like heaven on a factory worker's budget. That's genius. I'm just the translator." The first year, 2023, Avu received 1 star. I called Declan from the kitchen floor, sitting between the prep station and the walk-in cooler, unable to stand because my legs had gone liquid. Bento was crying into a pot of stock. Our pastry chef, a quiet woman from Porto named Ines who'd worked at some of the best restaurants in Europe before coming to Maine because she wanted to smell the ocean every morning, was sitting on a milk crate holding her phone and saying, "A verdade. It's true." Over and over. 1 star, I said to Declan. December. 1 star. "I know," he said. "I'm looking at it right now. I'm so proud of you, I can't breathe." "Don't tell your family." Marigold. "Please. Not yet. I need this to be mine for a while. Mine and the team's and Avu Celeste's. Before it becomes a Crane Whitfield conversation." He didn't. God bless Declan Whitfield. He kept my secret with the same patient loyalty he'd shown for our entire marriage. He went to Thanksgiving in Wellesley and ate champagne brine turkey and said nothing while his mother served cranberry sauce with Grand Marnier and his brother discussed the performance of the S&P 500. When Judith asked him, as she did every year, "How's Marigold's little cooking thing going?" he said, "She's doing well, Mom," and changed the subject. The 2nd star came in early 2024. 2 Michelin stars. 32 seats. A converted fishing warehouse on Custom House Wharf. Portuguese peasant food. The food world noticed. Reservations went from a 2-week wait to a 3-month wait overnight. The New York Times ran a feature with the headline, "In a Maine fishing warehouse, a chef turns her grandmother's recipes into Michelin magic." Food critics from London, Paris, and Tokyo started making the trip to Portland. A Japanese food magazine did a 6-page spread. Bon Appetit put me on the cover, standing in my kitchen in a white chef's coat with a wooden spoon in my hand and a pot of caldo verde behind me, with the headline, "The most exciting chef in America doesn't want to be famous. She wants you to remember your grandmother." I told Declan about the 2nd star, and Declan cried in the parking lot of our house for 10 minutes, and we still didn't tell the Crane Whitfields. And then, 6 weeks before Thanksgiving 2024, I received a call from a producer at the cooking channel. They were developing a live broadcast celebrating the year's most significant restaurant achievements. Gordon Ramsay was hosting, and they wanted to announce Avu's third Michelin star live on air. 3 stars. The highest rating Michelin gives. There are only 13 3-star restaurants in the entire United States. And my grandmother's food, the food of fishermen's wives, the food my mother-in-law had called poor people food, was about to become one of them. The broadcast was scheduled for Thanksgiving Day, 6 p.m. Eastern, which meant that at approximately 6:14 p.m., while I was sitting at Judith Crane Whitfield's 12-seat dining table eating champagne brine turkey, Gordon Ramsay was going to call me.
Now.
Back to the table. Back to the caldo verde cooling in its pot on the kitchen counter, banished from the dining room. Back to Judith and her Waterford crystal and her satisfied smile. Dinner continued. The turkey was carved. The truffle butter stuffing was distributed. Graham discussed a new investment vehicle. Sterling's wife, Margot, talked about their renovation in Nantucket. Declan was quiet beside me, eating steadily, his left hand resting on my knee under the table. At 6:12 p.m., my phone buzzed. At 6:13, it buzzed again. At 6:14, it rang. I'd left it on the table, a habit Judith hated, which is partially why I did it, and the screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize but was expecting. "Aren't you going to silence that?" Judith asked. "Actually," I said, "I need to take this." I picked up the phone, and because the universe has a sense of theater that I will never fully understand, I pressed the speaker button. "Hello, Marigold? This is Gordon Ramsay." The table went silent. Not the gradual silence of people trailing off mid-conversation. The instantaneous silence of a room full of people who just heard a name that every person who's ever turned on a television recognizes. "Chef Ramsay," I said. "Happy Thanksgiving." "Happy Thanksgiving to you. Listen, I'll make this quick because I know you're with family, but I wanted to be the first to tell you. Actually, I wanted to tell you, and about 4 million viewers at the same time." A brief pause. The sound of a live studio audience in the background. Marigold Costello Whitfield, your restaurant Avu in Portland, Maine, has just been awarded its 3rd Michelin star. My hand was shaking. I pressed the phone flat against the table so everyone could hear, and the silence in the Wellesley dining room was so absolute that you could hear the studio audience cheering through my phone speaker. 3 stars, Marigold, Ramsay continued. 32 seats. Portuguese cuisine. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? You're one of 13 restaurants in this entire country. And you did it with caldo verde and bacalhau, and the recipes your grandmother brought from the Azores. You made peasant food into the most celebrated cuisine in America right now, and I have never been more proud to make a call like this. I looked up from the phone. Graham had stopped chewing. Sterling's wife Margot had put her hand over her mouth. Declan was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as the face of a man who has waited 11 years for a single moment and is now watching it happen exactly as he imagined. And Judith. Judith Crane Whitfield was holding a fork, sterling silver, because Judith did not use stainless, and as the words 3rd Michelin star and 13 restaurants in the entire country settled into the room like ash after a firework, that fork slipped from her fingers and hit the spode dinner plate with a sound like a small bell ringing. Or a small world ending. "Chef Ramsay," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. "I'm sitting at my mother-in-law's Thanksgiving table right now. She made a beautiful meal. And I brought a pot of my grandmother's caldo verde, which is, well, it's been on the counter. But I think maybe it's time to bring it to the table." Ramsay laughed. That big, barking laugh. "Bring it to the bloody table. That soup is worth more per spoonful than anything else in the room, I promise you that. Congratulations, Marigold. You've made your grandmother very proud." The call ended. The studio audience faded. And the Wellesley dining room sat in a silence so thick you could have served it on spode. Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute but was probably 10 seconds. Graham broke first. "Wait, Avu. The restaurant in Portland? The one that's been in every..." He grabbed his phone, typed, and his face went through a transformation that I will remember for the rest of my life. The color drained, returned, and drained again. Marigold. This restaurant has a 3-month waiting list. The tasting menu is $340 per person. It says here you have 42 employees and gross revenue exceeding. He stopped himself, the investment banker in him recognizing that reading someone's financials at the dinner table was perhaps not the move. Exceeding what? Judith asked faintly. Graham looked at me for permission. I shrugged. $14.6 million annually, he said. From 32 seats. Sterling, the attorney, the one who practiced at Ropes and Gray and had never once acknowledged my career beyond a polite nod, leaned forward. The James Beard Foundation. You were a semi-finalist for Best Chef. Finalist, actually. This year they bumped me up. And the Bon Appetit cover, that was you? The chef in the white coat with the pot of caldo verde. Yes. I saw that cover. In my dentist's office. I saw your face on a magazine and I didn't, he stopped. He looked at his plate. I didn't recognize you. That sentence hit the room harder than the Michelin stars. 11 years of sitting across from someone at holiday dinners, and he'd looked at my photograph in a magazine and not known who I was. Not because I'd changed. Because he'd never actually looked. Then Richard, who had laughed when Judith pushed my soup away, Richard, who had never once in 11 years initiated a conversation with me about anything other than weather, stood up, walked to the kitchen, picked up the pot of caldo verde with both hands, carried it to the dining table, and set it down in the center, next to the champagne brine turkey. I'd like to try some, he said quietly. If there's enough. There was enough. There was always enough. Avu Celeste's recipe made enough for an army, because she had never once in her life made a pot of soup intended for fewer than 12 people. I served the caldo verde. I ladled it into Judith's spode blue Italian bowls, the ones she saved for special occasions, the ones with the price tag that I'd once accidentally seen, $85 per bowl. Peasant food in luxury bowls. Avu Celeste would have found that hilarious. Richard tasted it first. He closed his eyes. He was quiet for a moment, and when he opened them, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there in 11 years of sitting across from me at this table. Recognition. This is extraordinary, he said. And he meant it. Graham tasted it. Margot tasted it. Sterling tasted it. Thea, who had once asked, "Is that rice for Thanksgiving?" As if I'd served her gravel, tasted the soup and asked for seconds. Judith had not touched her bowl. She sat at the head of the table with her fork on her plate and her champagne going flat and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched her family eat my grandmother's soup with the expression of a woman whose entire architecture of taste and status and hierarchy was being quietly dismantled by a pot of kale and sausage. Judith, I said. You don't have to eat it. I know I don't. I mean it. I didn't bring it to make a point. I brought it because it's Thanksgiving, and my grandmother always made caldo verde on Thanksgiving, and she's been gone for 5 years, and making her soup is how I keep her alive. That's all it ever was. Judith picked up her spoon. Not the fork, the spoon. The right utensil for soup, because Judith Crane Whitfield was nothing if not correct about flatware. She dipped it into the caldo verde. She brought it to her lips. She tasted it. And Judith Crane Whitfield, the woman who had spent 11 years categorizing me as beneath her table, closed her eyes and made a sound that no Crane Whitfield had ever made at a Thanksgiving dinner. A small, involuntary moan of pleasure. She opened her eyes. They were wet. What is in this? She whispered. Kale. Potatoes. Linguica. Olive oil. Garlic. And about 70 years of my grandmother's love. It tastes like, she stopped. Tried again. It tastes like my mother's potato soup. I didn't know that about Judith. In 11 years, she had never once mentioned her mother's cooking. She had never mentioned her mother at all, except in the context of inheritance, the Waterford crystal, the pearl earrings, the house in Chatham. Your mother made potato soup? She was from Brockton, Judith said, and the word came out the way confessions do, reluctantly, like something that had been held underwater and was finally allowed to surface. She worked in a shoe factory. She made potato soup every Sunday because potatoes were what we could afford. She looked at her bowl. I haven't thought about that soup in 40 years. Here it was. The thing that was always underneath the Waterford crystal and the champagne brine turkey and the Wellesley address. Judith Crane Whitfield had not been born a Crane Whitfield. She'd been born Judith Polansky, daughter of a shoe factory worker from Brockton, Massachusetts, a woman who had married into money and spent the next 40 years making sure nobody remembered where she'd started. She hadn't pushed my food away because she despised Portuguese peasants. She'd pushed it away because it reminded her that she was one. Declan drove us home that night through the dark Massachusetts countryside. The leftover caldo verde was in a container on the back seat. Judith had asked to keep the rest, which was, in the language of the Crane Whitfield household, an act roughly equivalent to a public declaration of surrender. 3 stars, Declan said, reaching for my hand across the console. 3 stars. You know this changes everything. I know. The restaurant. The family. Everything. I looked out the window. Bare trees. Cold sky. The first stars of a New England November, sharp and clear as pins in velvet. She's from Brockton, I said. Your mother is from Brockton. I know. You knew. I found out when I was 16. Found her high school yearbook in a box in the attic. Brockton High, class of 1976. Her maiden name was Polansky. She never told us. Dad knows, obviously, but they never discussed it. It was just erased. 40 years of erasing where she came from. And 40 years of punishing anyone who reminded her. I thought about Judith in that dining room, tasting my grandmother's soup and remembering her mother's hands. I thought about Avu Celeste for feet 11, standing in her kitchen on Acushnet Avenue, making enough food for 12 people because she had never learned to cook for fewer, because in her world, there was always room, always enough, always another bowl. I'm not angry at her, I said. And I wasn't. Not anymore. The anger had done its job. It had pushed me through the 18-hour days and the pandemic and the years of being invisible at that table. But anger is a fuel, not a destination. You burn it and you move, and eventually you arrive somewhere the anger can't follow. She's going to come to the restaurant, Declan said. You know that, right? She's going to want to come. Good. Good. There's a table in the corner by the window, the one that looks out at Casco Bay. It's seats too. It's the table where I eat dinner when the restaurant closes, just me and whatever's left in the kitchen. It's the table where I ate alone on the night we got our first star and the night we got our second, because you were in Wellesley pretending everything was normal. Marigold. That table is Judith's. Whenever she wants it. No reservation needed. And I'll serve her caldo verde, and she can eat it or not, but it'll be there. Because that's what Avu Celeste would do. She'd set a place. She'd make the soup. She'd wait. Declan didn't say anything for a long time. The road unspooled ahead of us in the headlights, and the caldo verde in the back seat filled the car with the smell of garlic and kale and olive oil and something else, something that didn't have a name, but that Avu Celeste would have recognized immediately. Home. It smelled like home. Judith came to Avu on a Tuesday in December, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. She came alone, which surprised me. She sat at the corner table by the window, looking out at Casco Bay, where the lobster boats rocked in the winter chop. She ordered the tasting menu, 7 courses, each one a conversation between Avu Celeste's Azores and the Maine coast outside the window. She ate everything. When I came out of the kitchen after service, still in my chef's whites with a burn on my left wrist from the salamander broiler, Judith was sitting with an empty espresso cup and a look on her face that I'd never seen in 11 years. My mother would have loved this place, she said. Tell me about her. And Judith Crane Whitfield, born Polansky, daughter of Brockton, keeper of secrets, told me about her mother. About the potato soup. About the shoe factory. About the small apartment with the linoleum kitchen where a woman who'd never been to a restaurant in her life made food that tasted like safety. We talked for 2 hours. The staff cleaned up around us. The dishwashers went home. The kitchen went dark. And in the dining room of a 3 Michelin-star restaurant built on peasant food, 2 women from working-class families sat at a table by the water and finally, after 11 years, told each other the truth. Avu Celeste used to say that the difference between a good cook and a great one isn't technique. It isn't ingredients. It isn't training or talent or the number of stars on a plaque by the door. The difference, she'd say, pressing her thumbs into a ball of masa cevada dough, is whether you're cooking to feed people or cooking to show people. Feeding is love. Showing is fear. My mother-in-law spent 40 years showing. Champagne brine turkey. Truffle butter. Grand Marnier cranberry sauce. Every dish a performance. Every ingredient a proof of distance from Brockton and potato soup and the shoe factory smell she could still recall if she let herself. I spent 11 years feeding. Bringing caldo verde to a table that didn't want it because feeding isn't conditional. You don't stop cooking for people because they don't appreciate it. You cook because cooking is how you say the things that words can't carry. I'm here, I see you. There's enough, sit down. 3 Michelin stars didn't change that. The stars are extraordinary. I won't pretend otherwise. 13 restaurants in the country. Avu Celeste's food, served in a fishing warehouse in Maine, evaluated by the same inspectors who judged the best kitchens in Paris and Tokyo and deemed worthy of the highest honor they can give. That matters. That matters enormously. But what matters more is the pot of soup. The pot of soup that was too humble for the Wellesley table. The pot of soup that Judith Crane Whitfield pushed away because it smelled like where she came from. The pot of soup that Richard carried back to the table with both hands, like something sacred, which it was. The pot of soup that tasted like a mother in Brockton and a grandmother in the Azores and every woman who ever turned nothing into nourishment and called it dinner. That's what food does. Not Michelin food. Not champagne food. Not truffle butter food. Just food. The real kind. The kind that remembers. Avu is open 6 nights a week. The corner table by the window has a small brass plaque now, installed the week after Judith's visit. It reads, Mesada Avu, grandmother's table. All are welcome. Judith comes every month. She always sits at that table. She always orders the caldo verde first. And she always finishes the bowl,